you do play several dates with orchestras, and there are some recordings out there with groups like the London Symphony and so on. Will you continue to perform with orchestras?
Well, doing orchestral things goes back for me a long, long way. I mean, the first thing I ever played, I think, was actually one of the songs on the Jethro Tull Christmas album called A Christmas Song, where I played for the first time with string musicians, a string quartet, and mandolin. It was an interesting and nice combination. And through the years, I've done lots of recordings where there have been varying degrees and lineups of orchestral forces, of usually strings, woodwinds, occasionally brass, and I've done a few pieces of writing for orchestras. Something I wrote for the Scottish Ballet a few years ago, and also music which has been translated into orchestral music by an ex-Jethro Tull member, David Palmer, and performing live with orchestras, I only really started doing, I guess, 3 years ago, and I do that as a solo performer, not as Jethro Tull, because there is for technical reasons as well as artistic reasons, that there are real problems in bringing certain instruments together with orchestras. The electric guitar does not happily sit side by side with most of the orchestral instruments. It is a sound, not just a volume. It's an audio quality that actually really rubs up against and fights with most of the upper end of the strings. It's not a happy bedfellow. And whilst you can write music where you have sections of music for electric guitar and sections of music for orchestra, the two things, the temptation to put them together is rarely going to pay off. And then you get to the volume thing, you know, the kit drums, the drum set that we know that's played in rock, blues, jazz, every form of music is just too plain damn loud for an orchestra. It will totally wipe them out. And so when you have to mic up an orchestra to try and give it that extra volume that people at concerts are used to, you really don't want one loud musical source on the stage that's going to leak, going to feed into all the microphones right across that have to be over all the orchestral members, because it will just produce a god-awful sound, a real mess, and it's very, very hard to do. So we do things like, you know, screening off the drums with perspex screens to try and, you know, cut down a little of the volume there. We play at levels which is, I always say to the non-orchestral members, you have to think of yourself as being one of these guys. They're not playing with you, you're playing with them. The shoe is definitely on the other foot here. We have to become orchestral members. We have to integrate ourselves into their world. We can't expect them to somehow manage to become you know, 200-watt violin players on stage. They neither can nor want to play loudly. They want to play at natural acoustic levels. And so for me, it's relatively easy to make that switch, because I play acoustic instruments. That's what I do. So for me, it's just a twiddle of a knob, and I'm there. You know, for me, it's no problem at all. The human voice, the flute, they sit naturally within the other orchestral instruments. But electric guitars, electronic keyboards, electric basses, and particularly drums and percussion instruments, they are the ones that it's very difficult to control.
How about some of the other aspects of that? We have in common, I think, an appreciation for Frank Zappa and the work he did. And he complained loudly and often about the difficulties of getting symphonic music performances off the ground. Not enough rehearsal time, the occasional indifference of performers, the excessive costs of having parts copied and so on, union restrictions. How's your experience been in dealing with that area?
It is a compromise, and therefore if you're going to go into that sort of a venture, you have to be prepared from the word go to make compromises in the overall scope of the performance as well as individual pieces of music, given that you are going to have, well, if you can afford to have 3 days rehearsal, well, maybe you would, but in reality, when I do them, it's a rehearsal day followed by a show day. So you have 2 lots of costs for 1 bit of income from the performance.
Right.
And they're very high costs, because of course the orchestral musicians get paid for rehearsals, for sitting and drinking tea, and for finding their way to work and getting home again, just as my crew and other musicians are getting paid for rehearsal, just as if they were doing a show.
Right.
And So it's very high costs against very little income. So first of all, you do it not with any expectation of making a profit, but with a reasonable expectation, in my case, of not making a loss, because I'm not being sponsored or funded by anybody. If I do those things, they have to pay their way. But that's about all they're going to do. And musically speaking, you've got to be reasonable and take into account that a portion of the music has got to be playable by orchestral musicians who will sight read the music. From the written music, they will see it, they will play it, and it will be more or less right. Even if they, first time, they've never seen it before. And some of the music requires, maybe a couple of run-throughs for them to find the pace and the feel of it and the dynamics, and for the conductor to integrate that with what I'm doing, for example. And then there's some pieces of music that are going to require, perhaps 4 or 5 times you have to go through this little bit because of timing and accent and ensemble playing, and you have to come up with an overall program where you can, perhaps in 2-3 hour rehearsals, you can manage to achieve what you've got to do. And for Frank Zappa, having listened to some of his work, it was just too plain difficult, and musically too complex, demanding technically as well as intellectually. So there's no way it would have been successful to bring that to an orchestra. In most cases, it would have been a difficult and unsatisfying experience. So I think he bit off more than he could chew in that regard. I would tend to write things that have different levels of difficulty, and also music that, to some extent, members of an orchestra will look at a passage and say, oh, okay, I think I know what that looks like. That's not going to cause them any difficulty. They have an immediate familiarity because it's in some way related to things that they will have played before in the classical world of music.
Right.
But stuff that gets more complex, more ethnic, more rocky, more jazzy, that has a feel, a groove that we contemporary or rock musicians or jazz musicians can have a natural feel for. They find it difficult to inject that way of playing into their performance, and sometimes you just do come up against a cultural divide. It's
their idiom. So
it's a question of experience and a question of what your sensitivities are. I mean, I usually, when it's possible, I invite a flute player to join me on stage for a duet when I'm doing the rubbing elbows thing, and that could be a 15-year-old student one night, or a couple of nights ago in Boston, it was the principal flautist of the Boston Pops Orchestra, and so it could be somebody at any level of professional ability, a young student or a seasoned first flautist in a major orchestra, and it's interesting to do that because the music is pretty easy, but to explain the feel and to explain some little, the nuances, the grace notes, the decoration, which you can write down, but then makes the music then immediately become quite difficult. We try and keep the music relatively simple, send them an audio file, by email, so they can hopefully open it up and listen to the music as well as see the written music on the page that they're going to play. I usually just try to get the feel if they have that ability to inject these other ingredients, then fine, we'll go with it. But if they haven't, and usually they don't have because they don't have experience of Celtic or Latin music that I've integrated into that particular piece, then they play it pretty straight, and I do the other stuff. I inject that into my part, but they can play it straight and the music still works. And it is interesting to see how people do it. It's just there are those folks who perhaps in their lives played a little bit of jazz or blues and have a feel for it. There are those people who just literally have only played the repertoire of classical music that they played from age 8 until perhaps their 40s or 50s, and that's all they've ever done. That's all they ever will do. It's all they want to do, which is fair enough. But I like the idea of you try and just push the boundaries a little bit, and for me it's pushing the boundaries to work with these people, and for them to pushing the boundaries to ask them to work with me. So it's challenging, not entirely satisfactory, for the sort of reasons I've explained. But generally the audience seem to like it because it's I think they sense the electricity that comes from that kind of performance, the sense of nervousness, the sense of suspicion that also lurks between the classical music world and the pop or rock world.